Hello everybody, welcome back to another video. This is the Star Economist, and thank you so much for joining me. So today I'm going to be talking about N+1 gameplay, what exactly it is and why it could be potentially such a big problem in the future for Star Citizen. And I'm hoping that through going through what has already happened in other games, as well as presenting my argument for why it might be a problem with Star Citizen, that some of the developers might see it, as well as the community as a whole may be getting a little bit of an understanding and awareness of what we might be in for in the future. And then perhaps through that awareness, leading to some changes in the envisioned systems in Star Citizen and the way that ships work, as well as the economy and the mission system, and perhaps moving things toward a system that might not be so strongly affected by this idea of N+1 gameplay. All right, so first off, what exactly is N+1 gameplay? So N+1 gameplay is basically the effect that occurs when you are allowed to have an arbitrary number of players playing in the same game space towards whatever objectives that they might be trying to achieve. So for example, throwing 5 or 6 or more players at an objective where one player might have been sufficient, just to ensure that you roll over any opposition that was there. So N+1 gameplay is actually a very new or relatively new phenomenon, and that's because most real-life sports and hobbies that you see, such as chess and football and hockey, just to name a few, these all have specific numbers of players on each side, because it turns out that just using the game systems themselves, it is very, very difficult, perhaps even impossible, to fully balance a game when you have different numbers of players on each team. So basically, N+1 gameplay refers to the idea that having more players than an opposing team, or having the ability to apply any number of players to a mission or objective or a puzzle or a challenge, is at its core unbalanceable and imbalanced. So looking at the problems that come from N+1 gameplay. So first off, we have to consider that it's not just something that harms the losers in a battle, but it's also something that harms the winners as well. Because when you win based simply on a numerical advantage, the feeling of overcoming a challenge or the feeling of victory is actually very diminished. And of course, this goes hand in hand with the feeling on the losing side as well, where you can just chalk your loss up to being at a numerical disadvantage, which doesn't feel very good, especially if you've invested time into trying to get better at the game or better at the challenge. Even without knowing the specifics of a game, you can see from the footage and from what it actually looks like to do these challenges with a numerical advantage that it's not very skillful, it's not very difficult. It seems just, clicking buttons and following the horde or the blob. Some of the other core problems that come from this sort of gameplay include, number one, zerging and blobbing. So this is where you have a very, very, very high concentration of players in as small of a game space as possible. We see this with like EVE Online, for example, everybody trying to concentrate into a single fleet. We see this with Guild Wars and many other games. There's also the issue of dumbing the game down in both the PvE and the PvP areas. Whereas if you can just throw more players at a problem or in a PvP fight, then it just makes sense to try to get as many players as possible into your group. And this of course leads to most groups just trying to get their blob bigger and approach challenges and approach even player versus player conflict with as many people as possible, instead of it actually being a skill-based thing or a teamwork-based thing or having to apply innovations to the meta. Another problem that games suffering from N+1 gameplay can run into is also the idea of force multipliers. And these are items or ships or anything that gives a player an inherent power advantage over other players, regardless of skill. And these things are usually bought with in-game currency or bought with the time of players in terms of grinding. And the unfortunate part of this is that usually player time is treated very similarly, regardless of their skill. So you don't need very skilled players to get these force multipliers. It just feeds into the idea that the more players you have, the more money, the more in-game whatever you can grind, which gives you a force multiplication advantage over competitors, and it just feeds into itself until you realize that, you know, the best strategy is just get more players. And then taking all these problems together, finally, you see that games with a low skill ceiling and or a very defensive or slow sort of gameplay feed very much more into this problem of N+1 gameplay. If you look at Counter-Strike Go, for example, a single very skilled player without any other assistance can take on entire teams by himself. And this is because it's very fast-paced. He can apply his skill very quickly before the other team is able to just bring all of their resources in and take him out. Whereas if you look at a game like PlanetSide 2, for example, and specifically the tank gameplay, tanks can be repaired. Tanks can get behind cover, which is invulnerable. Tanks require many shots to destroy. And so you'll see that as long as these guys have a numerical advantage, they're not going to be losing the fight, even if, you know, the people themselves in that blob are, you know, low skilled, because there's no option on the other side for very skillful gameplay to overcome in their blob. They're just going to roll over the opponents. And this is the core issue with N+1 gameplay. And this is what all of these problems kind of come together to produce. So before I jump into exactly how this all affects Star Citizen and what the potential problems are, I'd like to just look quickly at what is already happening in current games because of these problems. So if you look at EVE Online as a really great example, this shows the end game, quote unquote, of what happens when you leave this N+1 gameplay issue unchecked for a long time. And so basically what you have is you have a super coalition that controls most of the space of the game, and everybody is allied to each other. And so they have the most people, they have the force multipliers for all those people, titans and super capitals, etc. And so they've technically won, but now in terms of PvP, there's no gameplay left because you already have everybody on the same team basically. And so this is a pretty big problem. You know, a lot of people saying the game is stale, and you can see a steady decline in the number of people. And, you know, I would never want to play in EVE Online as it is right now as a PvP player. Looking at a little bit more of a short-term time scale or something that can happen in a game much, much quicker than the quote-unquote end game that is seen with EVE Online and what happens with this N+1 issue, just look at Atlas. So with Atlas, one of the biggest problems with the game and what caused huge player declines was that you had Chinese players who had a huge player base and were naturally inclined to group up with each other, going to servers and basically having a server supermajority almost from the get-go. So you would see these Chinese groups just completely rolling over all other groups, just going to islands, destroying everyone on the island, taking all the resources, and just moving on. And what kind of gameplay is this? Like, people are trying to gather resources. They're expecting a fairly fair game. I mean, they're expecting a chance to defend themselves, a chance to, fight and enjoy the game. But when you have this group of, hundreds of players that just come in and they can win versus you with just, bare fists, just rolling you over. I mean, where's the fun, right? And with a lot of these servers, you see that the end result is the entire server is just gone. Everyone's left. And then, no one's interested to come back. So basically, the effects of unchecked N+1 gameplay and people trying to exploit the number of players, giving them an advantage, this is a serious problem. This issue of unchecked N+1 gameplay is usually most easily resolved through restricting the number of players that can be on each team, as well as the number of players who can approach and do any sort of objective or puzzle or challenge in a game. The problem with this being a solution for a lot of games, especially open world games and MMOs, is that the idea of restricting players on each team and restricting the number of players that can approach objectives and challenges goes directly against the core gameplay of many MMOs, which is supposed to be about an open world. It's supposed to be about being able to team up and go with any number of your friends to do anything. So World of Warcraft is a great example of this, of seeing how you started with a very open world PvP experience, a very open world PvE experience with a lot of raid bosses just being out there, and you could throw whatever number of players you wanted at it. And then looking at how the game progressed, and what the development team did is that they moved more and more and more towards game modes and content that heavily restricted the number of players that could attempt it, in terms of PvP battlegrounds and in terms of raids with a capped number of players, etc. Another good example of the ways that some games have tried to approach this issue of N+1 gameplay is that they've actually designed the game's systems from the bottom up to support having a large number of players that would be able to move between objectives with whatever number of players they wanted to. So for example, if you look at PlanetSide and PlanetSide 2, you would have objectives that you could throw whatever number of players you wanted at it, but you'd have timers that would force you to keep those players there, as well as having multiple objectives that could all be attacked at the same time, which would force you to split your forces into multiple groups if you wanted to compete at a quote-unquote competitive level, and if you wanted to win. Another good example of gameplay systems that are specifically designed to avoid the N+1 problem is in World of Warcraft with the open world raid bosses, where these bosses would usually have specific abilities that would scale regardless of the number of players that were there, and to even be stronger based on the numbers of players that were there, which almost functioned as a soft cap for the number of players you could have approaching the objective anyways, which is almost the same as restricting the number of players that can approach the objective in any case. All right, so getting down to the core point that I wanted to make with this video, how does this all apply to Star Citizen? And then what sort of problems could it cause for the game? Okay, so first and foremost, Star Citizen as it is envisioned and as it plays currently allows you to form fleets with other players with an arbitrary number of ships. So you could have 100 players in 20 hammerheads, you could have 100 players in 100 fighters. There are no restrictions and no gameplay systems that restrict the number of players, the number of ships that you can throw at the problem. And looking at all the information we have right now from the design documents, the vision that Chris Roberts gave us, all of the developer talks, Nothing says anything about restricting the number of players that can group up together and do missions or get into fleets and fight other enemy fleets. Besides being able to make fleets of arbitrary size, we also have the potential issue of a very strong focus on disable, not destroy, or disable, not kill gameplay. This focus on slower gameplay of allowing people to recover from losing and from getting destroyed or disabled and from getting shot, maybe a lapse in their concentration or whatever, it will enable the larger group to much more easily recover or bring their numbers to the fight than if we had something more like Counter-Strike, where you could, within a couple of seconds, take someone out of the fight and then win the round based on that, instead of them being able to just resurrect or get back up, as you see in Battlefield and a lot of other games. One other potentially huge problem is that the game as currently envisioned says that we will be able to hire NPCs for almost any role that a player can take. That means you can put NPCs into guns, you can get them to man stations, and the only thing that NPCs require is just, again, in-game currency. And going back to what I said originally, currency will be based on the amount of time that players put into the game, which means that larger organizations with more players will make more currency. And this is a huge potential force multiplier issue, where an organization that has a ton of money might be able to just put every player into hammerheads and capital ships that are all being gunned by NPCs. I mean, sure, it's going to cost them a lot, but in PvP, you're talking about who's winning, who's losing. The guys who are burning a ton of money on missiles and NPCs manning the guns, they're the ones who are winning. So if you don't have the money, you're looking at the same situation that EVE Online has been suffering from for a long time with their titans and super capitals. And it's going to be even worse in Star Citizen, because you have to pay maintenance on ships, and they're going to be even more of a drain. So you're never going to see small numbers of players, regardless of their skill, have these sorts of force multipliers, because again, it just comes down to grinding a number of players. And again, from what we currently know, there are no systems designed to stop players from having access to these huge force multipliers. So let's say Star Citizen launches and these problems have not been resolved. They have not been approached by any sort of gameplay system. What's going to happen? So first off, we're going to see skill being removed as a factor from a lot of the game's content. For example, bounty missions. Okay, let's imagine that there's some really hard bounty missions. They spawn 20 fighters. Okay, so players that have access to force multipliers, for example, like a hammerhead, they just get in there with their NPCs and their hammerhead, and they just sit there. And the NPCs and that one player, okay, they get through the 20 fighters and they get their reward. All right, and they go on to the next quote-unquote challenge. But there's no challenge in that, right? Because the NPCs just did everything. Whereas you look at another player, maybe they're like an elite, fighter pilot, okay? So they go in there with, let's say, like a Gladius, okay? And they just work their ass off trying to take out these 20 NPC fighters by themselves. Takes them a long time because they have like 1/20th of the DPS of that hammerhead. And that player finally resolves the challenge. They feel really great about themselves. But in the end, because the challenge could have just been done by someone abusing this force multiplier issue or just bringing more friends, that kind of sense of victory and of achievement is diminished. And this will also happen in PvP, where you'll have large numbers of players just bringing all these force multipliers and coming in huge massive fleets. And because there's no system that restricts the number of players that you can bring to a fight, it's never going to be balanced. It's going to be the same thing as you see in EVE Online, in Guild Wars, and other games where you can have as many players blobbed up or zerged as you want. You're going to have every single battle being one fleet or one group larger than the other. And then people are going to realize very quickly that it's just the number of players that you can bring. It's the number of force multipliers. It's how much you can grind. How do you grind? You get more players. And that's what we're going to end up with. Basically, no skill required gameplay. I mean, you're an elite fighter pilot? That's great. But this absolute noob who just joined the game yesterday brings, again, like a hammerhead with all NPC gunners and rolls through the same content that you can barely beat. I mean, what is that, right? And so the final major effect that is going to occur from Star Citizen, as currently envisioned, being heavily susceptible to N+1 gameplay, is that every form of content in the game that players touch is going to be impossible to balance because you are able to utilize whatever number of players you want. So, you want to have really difficult bounty missions that require player skill. It's never going to happen unless you restrict the number of players, right? As an example, you want to have really skillful PvP fleet battles. Again, it's not going to happen because who would engage in a fair fleet battle if they can just throw larger numbers at the opponent? So what are some of the solutions to this issue? First and foremost, force multipliers, ships and NPC gunners and NPCs that are hireable, as well as the AI blade system, from the get-go needs to be designed and balanced and created with the idea in mind that players should never, ever be able to simply purchase a flat advantage over other players with these systems. And when I say a flat advantage, I mean in a specific role. And when I say role, I mean a specific form of gameplay or something that a player can do. So for example, let's look at torpedo interception. In this example, a light fighter like an arrow, let's imagine that the developer's intent is to use the arrow as a primarily a torpedo interception ship, okay? What that means is the player in an arrow should never be at a base disadvantage compared to someone who might be in something like, again, a hammerhead with a fully NPC crewed ship. However it's done, either through the arrow having more maneuverability, more speed, whatever, if the primary function of the arrow is to be a torpedo interceptor, then a player must be able, with the same amount of skill, to be just as competitive at that specific role as any other ship in the game, including capitals, regardless of how much money has been poured into their usage. Again, in this example, if the hammerhead with a full crew is able to intercept torpedoes much more easily than the arrow, then every single PvP encounter would never use an arrow for the purpose of torpedo interdictions. Basically, when it comes to force multipliers, cost or things that could be grinded for should never ever be considered as a balancing point or as a way to balance the gameplay. Another way that this N+1 issue could be approached is through the scaling, at least on the PvE side, of missions based on the number of players that are there and are attempting the mission. So what this could mean is that if you have 10 players, maybe a single capital ship will spawn. If you have 20 players, maybe 2 or 3 capital ships will spawn. However, the only way for this sort of balancing to actually work is if the effect of force multipliers is very, very, very well dampened. So that, again, if you have the role, for example, of destroying fighters, to make sure that a player in any ship or any role, one player equals a certain amount of effectiveness. Without this sort of balance of force multipliers, if you allow someone to just crew a whole capital ship by themselves, for example, it's going to be impossible to know how much actual contribution that player can give. And so any challenge that you would try to build a scaling system on would never work. In PvP, of course, it's a little bit different because you can't directly scale the encounter, right? You have this number of players against this other number of players. Of course, as a soft system that I personally don't really think would work, but it would be really cool, if players engaged another player fleet, maybe the NPC factions in that region could be used as reinforcements for the fleet that has less players. And again, we're assuming that each player is equivalent in terms of the amount of power that they can bring to the battle. But this might be difficult to balance, of course. Looking at the other side of things, you could just go with a hard cap system. Some sort of system that if a player fleet engaged another player group or fleet with much lower number of players, maybe they would be highly penalized by the game in some way. Maybe there's some sort of reputation system that is directly affected by engaging with small groups of players and quote unquote ganking them or rolling them over. Maybe there's some sort of honor system in the game. Of course, you could just look at the hard alternative, which would be forcing player fleets to always have the same number of players. But again, this goes against the kind of core idea of Star Citizen as being an open world, right? A persistent universe that you can play with your friends. And so it's going to be very difficult to do that for PvP for sure. Again, though, we might go back to a quote-unquote honor system, possibly supporting this idea of having a hard cap number of players in each fleet. Maybe the future of PvP, fleet battles in the game might be two organizations are at war and then they choose the number of players that they want to have at this battle, and then maybe they go to a site and maybe the game restricts the number of players, or maybe forces them to have 25 or 50 or whatever players based on the objective, like a raid. But I think that would work pretty well, though it would, of course, have that issue where some groups might have more players and they wouldn't be able to experience the content. Maybe those players would have to be spectators. And then on the other side, you might have some groups that simply don't have, that number of players, right? I think there's no perfect solution, but definitely for PvE content, having the mission scale based on number of players could work very well. And on the PvP side, of course, using a hard or a soft system to restrict or at least to strongly encourage players to fight in fairly even numbers would go a very, very long way towards allowing the game to, in the future, evolve towards fun gameplay that is requiring skill and requires teamwork and ingenuity to actually win, instead of just having to bring more players and bigger ships or more elite ships or more expensive ships or ships with more missiles and etc. To sum everything up, so N+1 gameplay is a huge issue in many MMOs today. It's caused the rapid decline of Atlas. It's always been a thorn in the side of EVE Online, and there's many more examples of other MMOs that have been destroyed by it. It causes real damage. N+1 gameplay is also strongly present in Star Citizen as it is right now with 3.7.1, and as especially the game is envisioned to be, where you will be able to buy larger ships and where you'll be able to get NPCs into various positions based purely on hiring with in-game credits and currency. And this affects all systems of the game. It's not just the PvP aspect, it's not just the PvE aspect. Trade and economy, everything else is also very strongly affected by unchecked N+1 gameplay issues. And then N+1 gameplay, the issue itself is something that demands that the game itself and the systems that are developed, the gameplay loops, are specifically designed to control the problem. It's not something that you can just slap in there. I mean, PlanetSide 2 has a hard cap number of players that can be on each team, but it still is having problems with this issue after so many years, because of how difficult it is to control where players go if you haven't designed the game from the ground up to do that effectively. And then finally, Star Citizen is an amazing game. Okay, it's an amazing game. I really hope that in the future, with launch and beta, everything, that we will get a game that rewards developing one's skill and the ability to work with a team and to work together. We have multiple ships trying to overcome a challenge, trying to beat another team, without simply losing or winning based on the number of people that are on your team or the opponent's team. Winning based simply on the number of people that you bring to the challenge or the fight it's a cheap feeling. The losers, they don't get anything out of it, and after a while the winners, it doesn't feel like anything. To make the game successful in the long term and for all of us to enjoy it and to have a good time and to really build something special, it has to focus on something other than just bringing more credits or more people to the challenges and to the gameplay that it makes. Thank you so much for listening to another one of my spiels here. I hope I brought a new perspective to you about the potential problems with this N+1 gameplay thing. I know that everyone who has backed Star Citizen wants it to succeed, and I really hope that this makes some sort of impact in kind of engaging people and making people aware of the potential problems we could have, and to kind of nip it in the bud and get just a really great game right off the bat. Thanks again so much, and I hope to see you in another video. Take care.